Hello everyone and welcome to LewisFiction and welcome to my pitch for a Marvel Spider-Man origin game. If you are new around here, I just want to encourage you guys to subscribe to the channel. We post new Spider-Man stories every single week, but if you are already subscribed, let's get straight into this. So sit back, buckle up, grab some popcorn and enjoy the pitch. This pitch will be split up into 3 sections: story, gameplay, and knickknacks like unlockables, suits, etc. So first, let's start with the most important thing, the story. We begin our story for the Marvel Spider-Man origin game on a school field trip to a science demonstration. During this trip, we play as Peter Parker as we learn basic controls. We are introduced to 3 influential characters in this scene, first being Flash Thompson, who in typical fashion bullies Peter Parker, pushing him over and knocking all of the books out of his hands. However, none other than Dr. Curtis Connors approaches Peter to help him. He picks his books up for him and reprimands Flash for his actions. During this scene, we also get the idea that Peter and Connors are quite close based off their interactions with each other. I know in Marvel Spider-Man 2 they don't seem as acquainted as you would think if they knew each other since high school. However, this will be explained later on at the end of the game. We are also introduced to Mary Jane Watson in this scene as well. Peter clearly has a crush on her and he will admire her throughout the scene. What will also be made explicitly clear, and a big story point at the start of this game, is that all the girls in Peter's class are obsessed with Tony Stark, aka Iron Man. Even Flash Thompson will look up to Iron Man as their hero. The Avengers will be the big superheroes at the time, so I imagine Tony Stark is the one that everyone looks up to. This will make Peter envious. He wishes he was a celebrity so girls would notice him, especially Mary Jane. Peter just wishes he wasn't a loser. This is then, of course, followed by the inciting incident of the whole game, and Peter is bitten by the radioactive spider. This is then followed by Peter blacking out and the screen cutting to black as the title screen Spider-Man Origins appears on the screen. We fade back in as Peter wakes up at home at the Parker household. Peter will get up out of his bed as we end up exploring the house. Once Peter reaches downstairs, we are introduced to Aunt May and Uncle Ben, who will both be sitting at the dinner table. Peter will ask what happened to him yesterday. He doesn't really remember that much. And Uncle Ben will be bubbly, fun, and charismatic, jumping up saying that he gave him and May quite the scare yesterday. He fainted on his school trip and nobody knows why. Peter looks to his hand and notices a small mark left on his hand by the spider that bit him. We will continue the scene as we get a nice few moments between the 3 of them, a nice, loving, happy family. Peter says he can't miss school today as he's got a test this afternoon, and Uncle Ben will say he can do anything but go to school today. Peter will say he has to, but Ben will insist that he can't after he just fainted out of nowhere. He should go to the doctors first. Peter will say he'll be fine, as he leaves the house anyway. May and Ben are in awe of Peter's dedication to school. On the TV in the background, however, in this scene, we will also get a small introduction and cameo from J. Jonah Jameson in one of his first episodes of Daily Bugle Live, reporting on the rising crime rates in New York and how suspiciously it all might link back to one man, Wilson Fisk. We cut back to Peter as we enter a time trial mission, where we have to get to school in a certain amount of time, dodging cars and pedestrians. This is then interrupted as a car almost hits us, and in just the nick of time, Peter maneuvers out of the way of the moving car and onto the side of the building. This will be Peter's first time discovering his powers. However, being mesmerized by what has just happened will have to wait. He still has a test to get to. Peter makes it to school on time when during the test he will start sticking to the pens and the paper. He starts getting flustered, wondering what the heck is going on with him as he tries to shake off the utensils. He eventually just stands up from the test and walks out of the classroom. This will then transition into a tutorial mission when we discover and start to use Peter's powers more and more, discovering his different abilities, including wall crawling, increased strength and stamina, and of course his spider sense. Peter by the end of this realizes one thing: his prayers have been answered. With these newfound powers, he could be famous, just like Tony Stark. And with that, no longer will he be bullied, no longer will anyone see him as a loser, and finally, he can impress Mary Jane. We cut to the next day and the start of Act 2 of our story. Peter is finally back in school full time and Mary Jane will approach him in the hallway, asking him if he's okay because of what happened during the science trip. This is our first interaction between the both of them. Peter is flustered but has more of a sense of confidence than he originally did. We also learn more about Mary Jane in this scene as well, learning that when Mary Jane grows up, she wants to be a journalist. She wants to write for the biggest newspaper in the city, maybe even go worldwide. We also learn in this scene that MJ and Peter have lived next to one another since Peter moved in with his aunt and uncle. And we also learn that they have been friends since they were kids, but during middle school and high school, they have sort of grown apart. However, Peter also has a crush on her, which is going to be the big benefactor in this scene playing on Peter's mind. The conversation will end and Peter will be feeling great. However, this is where we get our first major boss battle of the game, and it will be against Flash Thompson. Now, Flash might not seem like a boss battle at first, but as we go throughout the game, you'll start to notice that the bosses get more and more major, and they'll get harder and harder. Flash will continue to bully Peter, but Peter won't have any of it this time. With his newfound powers, he can finally put up a fight against his bully. Flash ends up getting really injured during this fight because Peter comes out on top. Peter, now feeling on top of the world with a constant growing ego, is sent to detention. During the detention, Dr. Connors will approach Peter and will tell him that he's better than that, but Peter tells Connors that Flash deserved it. Connors, after seeing how Flash has treated Peter for all these years, just stays silent until Uncle Ben comes to fetch Peter. After Uncle Ben picks him up, Peter is silent in the car ride home. And Uncle Ben will ask Peter, why did he hurt Flash? And Peter will say, wasn't it obvious? Flash deserved it. He's been bullying him for years, so he deserved to get hurt. Ben will sigh as he carries on driving. He ends up pulling up to an old lake that him and Peter used to fish at when he was a kid. Peter will ask Ben why they are here, and Ben will simply get out the car and sit on the bench by the lake. Peter joins him, and once again, he asks Ben, why are they here? Ben will go on to ask Peter if he remembers this place, and Peter will say he does. Ben will go on to talk about the days and the times where they used to fish together, how whenever they caught a fish, they would always throw it back. Not because they could, but because it was the right thing to do. He'll say even though they could have kept the fish and they had the power to do so, they didn't. Peter will ask why he's telling him this, and Ben will say with great power comes great responsibility. Just because he could have the chance to injure Flash doesn't mean he should have. Peter arrogantly doesn't get the point Ben is trying to tell him, and he's still convinced Flash deserved what he got. Ben will say no matter how much Flash deserved it, it should be within Peter's moral code to restrain. But Peter still doesn't get it. We then cut to a scene where Peter is on the phone with a wrestling contractor as he builds his web shooters at the same time. The contractor, also known as Mr. Ditko, is listening to Peter explain his power base and how he could be a valuable asset. Peter says he wants his name to be up in the stars as the greatest wrestler to have ever lived. He wants to be a celebrity like Tony Stark. Ditko says to hold his horses. Since he's 15 and by law technically isn't allowed to move into this industry, he's gonna have to keep his identity a secret for now. Peter, bummed out, still accepts this, thinking that this is still his way to fame and stardom. Peter also works on a suit at the same time during this, as we are introduced to the wrestling suit as Peter builds it from scratch. We then get a short cutscene to Dr. Connors and his family. We learn more about him as a character. He comes home after work and we are introduced to Martha and his young son Billy. However, he can't pick Billy up or do normal fatherly activities with him. This makes Kurt feel like a fraud and not a real dad. He feels like he's not good enough for Billy. He'll never be able to play sports with him or teach him how to ride a bike. This gets Kurt down as we can see how it affects him. We get introduced to a formula that Kurt is working on in the background, using lizard DNA to be able to regrow his arm. Martha, however, doesn't agree with this, saying he thought he left this idea of regrowing his arm behind when he left his medic post and became a teacher. Connors will say him not being able to be a real father and husband has plagued him for long enough, and this is the way that he's going to able to amend that. He wants to be able to do things with his son that normal dads do. We then cut to our second major boss battle of the game. This time, it's Peter's first wrestling match. Peter in the ring will use his brand new abilities, including his web shooters, which this mission will also act as a tutorial for, to take down his opponent. After the fight is done, Peter will meet back up with Mr. Ditko, as he says it was a great fight and his career is off to a great start. Mr. Ditko suggests that Peter does interviews with the press. During his interview, Peter is asked what name he goes by, and this is where, on the fly, he comes up with Spider-Man. After the interviews, Mr. Ditko tells Peter that the name Spider-Man is actually really bad, and that they need to change it, but other than that, it's been a very successful first outing. On the way back to the studio, a man can be heard shouting in the background, as someone running pushes past Mr. Ditko and Peter, almost knocking them to the ground. It's a burglar. The store owner comes out running their way and looks towards Spider-Man, saying he could have stopped that guy. He's seen him on the TV and saw what he did to that wrestler. Peter will angrily point his finger at the store owner, saying he's a wrestler, not a superhero. It's not his problem. The store owner will frown and walk away as Mr. Ditko gives him the thumbs up and leaves Peter behind as he enters his studio. It's getting later and later, and Peter looks towards his phone on the way home to see multiple missed calls from Aunt May and Uncle Ben. Once Peter eventually gets home, Aunt May is furious with Peter, saying that if he is to be late, he is to answer his phone, or call one of them to tell them that he's gonna be late, because they have been worried sick. Uncle Ben more calmly approaches the situation, telling Peter that May is upset, but she's right. He can't be coming back at this time at night, especially with all the elevated crime recently that they've been hearing about over the news. Ben goes on to lecture Peter once again about responsibility, and this pushes Peter over the edge. He says he's done with Uncle Ben's lecturing as he storms out of the house. Ben says he should go after him, but May stops him, saying just let him go. However, when Peter finally calms down, he looks to his phone to see multiple missed calls from Aunt May once again. And when he finally reaches home again, coming back to apologize, he sees the police outside of his house. Wondering what has happened, Peter storms back into the house to see Aunt May crying her eyes out with 2 officers surrounding her on the sofa. Peter asks what happened, and an officer tells Peter that his house was robbed and his uncle has been shot dead in the process. Peter collapses and embraces Aunt May, a blunt expression on his face, lost for words as to the feelings he is experiencing. However, Peter leaves the house, furious, willing to hunt down the man who killed his uncle. Peter overhears some police radio that the man who killed him is heading further east through Queens as Peter leaves, putting on his Spider-Man wrestling suit as to not be seen in the night. This is when we engage with our 3rd boss battle and our first major stealth mission. This mission will be hunting Ben's killer through a dark warehouse. However, you have to stay in the shadows, similar to the noir portions of Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions. If you don't stay in the shadows, the burglar will shoot you, and you will lose life very, very quickly. Peter eventually finds his way to the burglar as they have an interaction. Peter realizes that it's the same guy that he could have stopped before in the street earlier that night. Peter webs up the guy, saying he could kill him right here and right now, but that's not what his Uncle Ben would have wanted. That's not the man who you murdered in cold blood would have wanted. Peter takes the higher ground and leaves the warehouse in shock as the police arrive on the scene, as we actually get our first appearance from Captain Watanabe as she detains the criminal. We cut to Uncle Ben's funeral a few weeks later. It's a sad scene, but a reflective one. Peter narrates to himself that he could have stopped the man when he had the chance, but he didn't. He didn't use his great power for great responsibility, and that's what Ben was trying to teach him all of this time. Not only that, if he hadn't stormed out of the house, he might have been there to do something about it. It's all his fault. It's not just one, it's a double whammy. A few days later, Peter is then back in school full time, and everyone is extremely sorry towards him, even Flash Thompson. Peter doesn't want anything to do with Flash, so will push him away, but Flash doesn't fight back. He just tells him he's sorry. Peter will leave it when Dr. Connors pulls him aside. Connors and Peter talk it out. This scene will be nice because Dr. Connors also makes it abundantly clear to Peter that he's always there for him when he needs. Peter will just hold his head down, but Connors will tell Peter to talk, to get it off his chest, tell him everything that's on his mind. Peter will tell Kurt that he's lost. He says to Kurt that he had an argument with his uncle the night that it happened, and he stormed out of the house. He came back later to find out that he died, and he could have done something about it if he was there. He'll go on to say that his uncle always preached about responsibility, and Peter wasn't responsible. Connors will say to Peter that responsibility is doing what you think is right personally, and now he's learned maybe he should look out for the people that need it. There's always a lesson in every action. Peter will ponder over this. However, as the scene comes to an end, Peter will spot a strange formula on Dr. Connors' desk that doesn't look like it's a part of the syllabus. He plays it off for now though, but this is an important fact that will loop back around in the story later on. Peter will go home and look towards his wrestling Spider-Man suit and think to himself that maybe he can make a difference. This is where we get a scene of him making his new suit, his first real Spider-Man suit, the black and red Ditko suit. It's baggy, not perfect, but his first proper representation of Spider-Man. This is when Peter starts stopping crime, as we follow a small side plot of Peter tracking down the man behind a bunch of bank heists. It also turns out that they're all linked to the news report during the start of the game about Wilson Fisk. This will lead to a boss battle with Peter engaging with one of his first ever major villains, the Vulture, as was stated in Spider-Man Miles Morales in one of the training missions. The Vulture, 8 years ago, before the events of Marvel Spider-Man, will have been working under Wilson Fisk. This will then lead to another boss battle and the second biggest boss battle of this entire game thus far, which will be against the Shocker, who has also been working under Wilson Fisk. Peter and the Shocker engage, and it's followed by a chase sequence before another big encounter between them both. After getting his behind handed to him a few times, Peter eventually comes out on top, using his intellect and intelligence to outmaneuver Shocker and take him out. We then cut to a scene where MJ knocks onto Peter's house. She comes around to see how Peter is doing after the death of Uncle Ben. During this scene, we get our first romantic tension between MJ and Peter. Peter will say to MJ that he never thought anyone noticed him, but MJ has been there for him, asking him how he is all this time. MJ will say that she's always seen him. After all, they grew up together. She could never forget the special memories that they've shared living next to each other growing up. MJ will place her hand on Peter's as they share a really nice moment. Aunt May, however, will interrupt as she brings in some freshly baked cookies in classic Aunt May fashion. We then cut to another scene with Dr. Curtis Connors. He finally develops the lizard serum and decides it's his responsibility to take it and to be a proper father to his son. And in an unexpected turn of events, it ends up working and he regrows his arm back. This is followed by a really nice scene between Kurt and his family, as he's able to pick up his son for the first time. His wife Martha is actually surprised but thrilled by this revelation. We then cut to the next day, where the class is at Midtown High. Peter looks in MJ's direction and MJ will look in his. It's becoming more increasingly clear the more we move throughout the game that there is more romantic tension than there between the two of them. Dr. Connors will then enter the class chirpier than ever, as everyone realizes his arm is back, and Connors is also excited to share this innovation. However, something is off, and Peter's spider sense starts going berserk. Connors then starts transforming during the class, and everyone is stunned. And Connors transforms into a giant lizard creature. The class starts scurrying as the lizard is out of control. The classroom starts collapsing around them as rubble was about to fall on MJ. However, Peter tackles her to the ground, saving her in the nick of time. MJ thanks Peter for his great reflexes as everyone starts running in the opposite direction to the lizard. However, Peter turns around, looking towards the lizard's direction. He looks back to everyone running and then turns back to face the lizard, gulping in the process but knowing this is his responsibility. Peter charges down the hallway, ripping his shirt off, revealing the Spider-Man costume underneath, and chasing after the lizard. This mission will use the intricacies of the school to chase the lizard through Midtown High and the corridors. This will eventually lead to a boss battle between Spider-Man and the lizard on the football field outside of the school. However, the lizard ends up coming out on top, as Peter has never faced anything quite like it, and as strong as the lizard before, as he escapes into the sewers. This is when the story ramps up to 100, and the fast-paced nature of the first two games starts to kick in as the world starts to transform into something a little bit more recognizable. This is crisis mode now for Peter Parker, and it's his responsibility to find Dr. Connors, to find his friend. He needs to take out the lizard before he hurts anyone, but not just that, he wants to rescue his friend. Peter, however, will need a cure. And this is when we enter another stealth mission, where we have to sneak through Midtown High to find the papers with the formula on that Peter saw earlier in the game. However, damage control will be around Midtown High at the time, and Peter will have to avoid them to acquire the papers. Once he gathers them, Peter will come up with a formula for a cure, and heads for the sewers. This next portion of the game will be Peter having to navigate the underground sewers of New York City, providing a new location to be explored by the player. After a few missions deducing clues to find Connors, he eventually will stumble upon the lizard once again. Spider-Man and the lizard will have their second major boss battle, which will lead to another chase sequence through the sewers, which will be timed as well. This leads us to the final boss battle between the two of them, as Peter managed to finally force the cure down the lizard's throat, turning him back into Dr. Connors. And with that, Dr. Connors is cured, and he returns back to the surface. Finally, Spider-Man wins. After the main bulk of the story is over, we enter Act 3. Spider-Man is now recognized as a citywide icon, making his presence known across New York City. However, this is where J. Jonah Jameson clocks onto Spider-Man, claiming that it was Spider-Man that turned Connors into the lizard, questioning if he's a hero or a menace. We cut to Dr. Connors during the aftermath, and he's lost everything because of the lizard. His family, his job at Midtown, but most importantly, he's lost part of his memory. You see, I understand that systematically, given the content we got in Marvel's Spider-Man 2, this story couldn't actually work without tweaking the canon a little bit. Therefore, I'm going to introduce the idea that a part of Dr. Connors' brain was actually affected when he was the lizard, and the reptilian side of his brain basically took away some of the core memories over the last 5 or 10 years or so. He will only partially remember things that are very important to him, including his family and of course his lifetime long work in science. But things like Midtown High, short-term relationships like he made with Peter Parker, will all be kind of fragmented in his imagination. This also kind of works with the story of Marvel's Spider-Man 2, as Peter and Connors actually met before they met in Marvel's Spider-Man 2, but the way Connors acts is almost if he's never met Peter before anyway. So maybe the lizard and the reptilian side of his mind has always took a toll on Dr. Connors, even after the event and fully recovering from what happened. Either way, at this point in Dr. Connors' life, he'll go back to being a medic, doing what he knows, but with the lizard still plaguing the back of his mind, scared that he may end up becoming it again at some point in the future. We cut back to Midtown High as they all sit down in class. A new student is introduced to the class, Harry Osborn, the son of the infamous Norman Osborn. They all greet Harry as he sits down. We then cut to one final scene of Peter and MJ, as Peter asks her on a date, and to his surprise, MJ says yes. Peter is delighted. And finally, we end with Peter designing his classic red and blue suit that he had during the start of the first game, and he has one final swing, ending the game there. I know there's a general consensus that if Spider-Man wins, Peter Parker loses. However, I wanted to take an opposite approach here. This is the first major story a part of the Marvel Spider-Man franchise, and Peter has a lot of hardship to come, as we know. He learns his lesson of responsibility, and when he applies that to being Spider-Man, he ends up winning, which significantly increases the impact of Ben's death in this game, and what it has and what it means to Peter in the story. So to give a bit of clarification there, that's why I made that decision. And with that, let's move on to gameplay. In terms of Spider-Man himself, he'll be very similar to the first game in combat. Most of the same moves will be available by the end of the game, and this game will make you work hard to unlock some of the basic moves that you have during the start of Marvel's Spider-Man 1. This will force the player to think more on their feet during some of the fight scenes and boss battles, just as Peter would in these scenarios, instead of just button mashing. There's a big emphasis in the story that I told that Peter has to use his intelligence here and there to come out on top in some boss battles, and I want that to be the case for the player as well, to make the experience of playing as Spider-Man a little bit more authentic. Anyway, moving on to side missions, there will also be 3 separate side missions that you can complete at the end of the game. The first is a short mission where you get to know Harry Osborn, setting up the connections and some of the flashbacks from Marvel Spider-Man 2 to the first game, and then the story leading into Marvel Spider-Man 1. This mission will be similar to the flashbacks during Marvel Spider-Man 2 as well. The second is a side story which follows on from the Shocker boss battle in the game, which will lead you to learn more about Wilson Fisk, aka the Kingpin, which sets up the initial rivalry that the two of these characters have that all boils over at the start of Marvel Spider-Man. And the third and final side mission will be one that tackles more of the underground sewer system, forcing the player to use more of it during free roam. During the final battle, some of the lizard DNA will have been left in the sewer and ingested by some sewer dwellers, causing some mutant creatures to start terrorizing the city. This could introduce villains like Vermin, Puma, and maybe even mini lizard monsters too. Spider-Man then has to put a stop to these creatures. In terms of the playable areas of the map, it will be the same as Marvel Spider-Man 2, except we substitute Brooklyn for an underground sewer system instead, which adds an extra layer of flair and depth to the map. This will also mean that Grand Central Terminal and the subways are also now accessible to the player and can be accessed through the sewer system as well. The general thug groups that you can stumble upon throughout this game will just be groups of general criminals and Fisk agents. Nothing more crazy than that. I didn't really want to overdo it with the thug groups, since obviously we've got Sable agents and Fisk agents and demons to come in future games. And with that, let's move on to the unlockables. Starting with suits, obviously the main 3 suits will be playable, including the wrestling suit, the Ditko suit, and the classic suit, which you unlock after completing the main story. You'll also get suit variations for the Ditko and wrestling suit, like battle damage versions. And since this is an origin game, you will also unlock variations of the homemade suit as well, like the Tasm, Raimi, and MCU homemade suits. You can also unlock pretty much every movie suit as well for Peter Parker. I would substitute some of the original suits that Insomniac would make for a custom suit designer also. Since a part of this story is dedicated to Peter making his own suit, I thought why not capitalize on that and use this as a way to introduce the idea of creating custom suits. You would have to gain XP by completing story missions, side quests, and defeating groups of enemies to unlock colours, emblems, and web patterns that you could then use in Peter's room to create brand new suits. In terms of location-specific unlockables, I would like there to be around 20 to 30 locations around New York, which holds a special memory between Peter and Uncle Ben. Peter would visit these places, take a photo of it, and put it in a scrapbook in memory of Uncle Ben. And quickly before we end the video, I want to touch on some things that I decided not to include in this game that maybe you might have thought I would have. The first one will be exploring more of MJ, Harry, and Peter as a trio. At first, I really wanted to include Harry in this game, but I didn't feel like Harry fit into this story, as his role would have been very similar to MJ's. And that would take away from what mediocre time there is with MJ's character anyway, so I thought it was just better to not include him until the end of the game. Plus, there's also a big emphasis on Peter being a loner and a loser throughout this game, which severely impacts his choices, which led to Uncle Ben's death. So if Harry was also a part of Peter's life and his best friend, and MJ was as well, and they were a trio, Peter, I don't think, would have had this issue. I also didn't use most other villains that appeared in the first game here, because this story takes place over a few months, so I thought it would be pretty unrealistic for more than 2 or 3 of his main villains to appear straight out the gate. He has been Spider-Man for around 10 years by the end of Marvel's Spider-Man 2, so I think it definitely would have been unrealistic. Either way, thank you very much for watching my pitch for a Marvel Spider-Man Origins game. If you did enjoy this video, make sure to hit a like on it, and also make sure to subscribe down below for more pitches for various different Spider-Man media. On the left-hand side of the screen, you can see my pitch for a Spider-Man Cinematic Universe, and on your right-hand side of the screen, you can check out my pitch for MTV Spider-Man Season 2. With that said, thanks to the members for supporting the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Take care, and peace.